Hello, everyone, and welcome. Happy Earth Month. My name is Vanessa Aramayo, and I am the Executive Director of Alliance for a Better Community, a Los Angeles Latino advocacy organization. I will be moderating today's event titled EcoLatino and Latinas, a conversation on environmental justice in Los Angeles. Today, we have three incredible panelists that are joining us and contributing to this conversation. Mark Lopez, East Side Community Organizer and Special Projects Coordinator at East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. Belén Bernal, Executive Director at Nature for All, and Dr. Michael Mendez, Assistant Professor of Environmental Planning and Policy at the University of California, Irvine. Welcome. Before we dive in, we at ABC would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Tongva, Gabrieleño, Fernandeño, Tataviam, and Chumash peoples, and their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. This meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. So as you all know, April is Earth Month. And during this month, many take action and participate in initiatives that focus on the urgent need for environmental justice, sustainable development, and climate solutions. As many know, environmental justice is the intersection of both social justice and environmentalism. However, as people of color, Latinos live at the front lines of these issues every day. Environmental justice is racial justice. Environmental justice is a Latino issue. And some also use the term environmental racism. But this isn't an issue that needs to be addressed only in the month of April. This is an issue that needs to be addressed daily. People of color are disproportionately impacted by environmental pollutants, resulting in generations of systemic discrimination. Latinos are particularly vulnerable to climate-related threats due to historic siting of fossil fuel operations in communities of color and a legacy of disinvestment. More than 60% of Latinos in the US reside in 4 key states that have historically experienced extreme events. This includes wildfires and droughts in California, rising sea levels and floods in Florida and New York, and hurricanes in Puerto Rico and Texas. In Los Angeles, more than 71% of Latinos live in areas with the most polluted air. For example, the development of freeway interchanges, most notably the East Los Angeles Freeway Interchange, has produced and perpetuated unhealthy air quality for Latino communities that result in increased risk of adverse respiratory health effects, such as asthma and other illnesses. This brings me to the work of ABC. Our mission at Alliance for a Better Community is to advance social, economic, racial equity, and justice for the Latino community and the Los Angeles region through power building and policy advocacy. ABC was created over 20 years ago due to both an education and environmental issue impacting students in the Los Angeles Unified School District. The Belmont Learning Complex, which many of you are familiar with, was known at the time to be the most expensive school built in the country, and it was intended to ease extreme overcrowding in majority Latino communities. The LAUSD Board of Education had stopped the project in 1999 due to fears about the health hazards of toxic gases beneath the former oil field where the school was to be built, and there were allegations of mismanagement. The construction project sat half unfinished on a polluted site after $154 million had already been spent. The completion of the school was to serve over 4,500 students in one of the district's most crowded corridors. It was the founders of ABC, local Latino civic leaders, who came together to create a plan to finish the school so that Latino children in the neighborhood had a near, environmentally safe, and healthy school to go to. LAUSD approved ABC's plans, and our organization actually took over the construction management of the project. The project was reactivated in 2002, but only with the help of special legislative action. AB 1301 required LAUSD to complete environmental investigations and submit findings to the state. This allowed for the land to be remediated and construction to be completed. The construction of the school spotlighted the need for environmental review over the construction of Los Angeles schools, and it also highlighted the need for Latino activism and power, which we will be covering today. It is what launched ABC into existence, and it is an example of the work we do to uplift the intersectionality of issues. Now, after 22 years, ABC has built on this momentum and advocated for a better life for Latinos in Los Angeles in many issue areas. Just last year, we released our Latino Scorecard Report, a policy roadmap for transforming Los Angeles. The report makes recommendations to advance equity in 5 key areas where Latinos have made positive strides, yet continue to face systemic obstacles. They include education, economic prosperity, civic engagement, public safety, and health. The report also includes 32 policy recommendations that capture the expertise of ABC's board of directors, our partners and organizations, community members, and industry experts. All of the report policy recommendations affect one another, but one in particular directly speaks to our event today. It is one of our health policy recommendations, which advocates for the development of healthy environments for Latinos and Latinas that promote livable communities with access to more parks and green spaces, areas for recreation and exercise, healthy foods and fresh produce, and clean air and water. In all of our work, we work with other partners and lean into their expertise to propel this work further. So without further ado, let me please pass over the mic to our panelists. For today's structure, we will take some time to speak to each panelist individually, and then we will bring them back together for a larger discussion with all 3. Today, we're going to start with Mark. Mark Lopez comes from a family with a long history of activism. He was raised in the Madres de Este de Los Angeles, Santa Isabel, the Mothers of East LA, Santa Isabel, Malasi, an organization co-founded by his grandparents, Juanita Beatriz Gutierrez and Ricardo Gutierrez. This set his trajectory as a community activist. He engaged in a wide array of student activism at UC Santa Cruz, where he earned his BA in environmental studies and taught university courses at UC Santa Cruz, Cal State Northridge, and the UCLA Extension. Mark earned his MA from the Chicana Studies Department at Cal State Northridge, where he completed his master's thesis entitled The Fire: Decolonizing Environmental Justice. Mark joined East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice as a member 3 years before joining the staff. After serving as the lead organizer for East Yard Communities and co-director with East Yard co-founder Angela Logan, Mark served as the executive director for over 6 years. He is now serving as the Eastside Community Organizer and Special Projects Coordinator. He organizes in the area where he was born in, raised, and continues to live. Mark is a 2017 North American recipient of the Goldman Environmental Prize, which is awarded to grassroots environmental champions from around the world. I'd like to take this moment now and welcome Mark.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you everybody at the ABC team for all the hard work to put today's event together, and of course, everyone who showed up.
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time and working with us and doing this. It's such an incredible conversation that we're looking forward to having. Mark, to start, would you please share your story and a little bit of how you got into this work? We've heard about the family that you were raised as, the incredible activism that you must have been exposed to at a very young age, but tell us a little bit more in your own words, why it is that you have made such a commitment to this work.
Yeah, sometimes folks will ask me like, what's kind of a early memory or something, right, from my family, from the movement, and I go back to my earliest memory. My earliest memory ever is being pushed in a stroller in Boyle Heights, headed to downtown LA in a march. And I remember distinctly like the Danza Azteca like group leading the march. And it was celebrating, celebrating that our community is coming together, celebrating that we're fighting, right? It isn't just about anger, right? It's about recognizing that we're coming into our own power. And so that being a very early memory really set the trajectory for me for the rest of my life. And so growing up in the movement, it was regular to me. It was normal, right? It wasn't something that I thought was different or special in any way. It was just my lived reality, right? It was normalized, and it's a very positive thing that was normalized. That kind of juxtapositions against the terrible things in our communities that are normalized, right? The pollution and so much more. And so, when I went to UC Santa Cruz, I knew I was coming back home. I was going there to pick up skills to develop my leadership capabilities to come back home. That was never a question, right? How I would be able to apply that was definitely a question, but that was always there. And so, you know, though I was encouraged by my family to go to college, obviously, there wasn't this kind of tone of like, you got to make it out, right? The tone was, you got to go and come back home. And so that's what I've done. And just really can't see myself, you know, doing anything else besides, you know, fighting for my community.
I love that. That's great. Eastern is doing some incredible work. Can you tell me, share a little bit, what most excites you about the work that the organization is doing now to make an impact in the future?
Yeah, you know, we have tons of campaigns and programs, and there's no way, you know, we could spend the rest of the event and still not touch on everything that East Yard works on. But I think the most impactful part of East Yard is the community building, is the leadership development that happens, because that's what sustains our movement, right? I often am talking to folks, and often we're even talking to folks around the country or around the world about how we build up our organization, and it's about our relationships to each other. If we know each other, then we're accountable to each other. If we're accountable to each other, then we're going to show up for each other. And when we show up for each other, that's what community looks like, right? And so that's what sustains us. We do get a lot of victories, that's for sure, right? So that's dope. But along the way, we're building something that is going to sustain us longer than a single campaign or the lifespan of a single program, right? It's really that community building that I think is in a lot of ways unique at East Yard, and is its strength.
That's incredible. And I can't wait to dive more into some of that work. We're going to shift and we'll bring you back into the room. We're going to shift. And next, I'm going to welcome Belén Bernal, who is the executive director at an incredible organization called Nature for All. Belén has more than 15 years of experience in leadership within the public and the nonprofit sectors, focusing on advocacy, nonprofit operations, finance, and program development. She has spent 11 years in elected office, and she's experienced in the public sector working on various positions in government. She's also served as city treasurer, mayor, and councilwoman of her hometown of Southgate. Woot woot, Sala. From 2009 to 2020, and she honorably served as Southgate's mayor twice during her time on city council. Welcome, Belén.
Vanessa, thank you so very much. Thank you, and to the Alliance for Better Community, really for the opportunity to share my story and sit on this panel with Mark and Michael. I'm truly humbled.
Thank you. So Belén, you've made quite a transition, and it's been having been exposed to the policy side, the administrative side of what was happening to our open spaces and our natural and open spaces. I'd love to hear a little bit about your interest in service and what it is that brought you to work at Nature for All. And we're going to get into the work that Nature for All is doing, but tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure, most definitely. So, I was listening to Mark, I totally could relate, but at the same time, I did have a different experience. I'm a daughter of immigrants. I grew up in Southeast LA, specifically Southgate, where experiencing the outdoors with my family revolved around, accessing whatever was available. Initially, we were in South Central LA, and at the age of 5 is when we moved into Southgate. So I saw the difference right away. We had a beautiful access to what I always said was a regional park, because we had folks from Compton, Cudahy, Bell Gardens, joining us in Southgate. And, with that occasional drive to the Santa Fe Dam, right, with family. But what I remember most were really the drives to Jalisco, Mexico, when my parents became residents and we were able to now travel and visit with family. That's really where I started to see the various landscapes, right? In the regions of Sonora, then into Sinaloa and into Jalisco, and how it changed. That same awe popped up again later in life when we were driving up the coast to Santa Barbara, where I completed my undergraduate studies. I studied sociology and Chicano studies. And all this to say that I never considered myself an outdoorsy person. Even while at Santa Barbara, folks were engaging in surfing and rowing. I never felt I belonged. That wasn't my space. However, it was okay, right? Because I was confident in who I was and really moving forward. And like Mark, I came back to my hometown and I knew I had to serve in some capacity. I didn't think it would be elected office. I was a catechist teacher, believe it or not, at the local church. I was a mentor with the Reardon programs at UCLA. There was just so many ways to serve. But this opportunity came up to serve in elected office. And that's really where, I learned the environmental injustices that were impacting not only my family, but also my community, right? You all know, surrounded by the various corridors, 710, 105 freeway, the Alameda corridor, all of this creating, air quality issues, traffic noise, asthma. My daughter, had asthma growing up. My mother, asthma, cardiovascular disease, obesity, you name it. So when I was offered the opportunity to say, would you consider, transitioning to the environmental justice, social justice space professionally, I have to say I almost shied away from it because I had always worked in social services, nonprofit hat, like you mentioned, for over 15 years while serving in office. But I said, this is my opportunity to be at the table, to really create what access looks like and be part of this conversation and represent us in a space where traditionally we haven't been. Unlike Mark, my upbringing was more about, think about it, immigrant parents, right? Pórtate bien, behave, don't rock the boat, just try to continue, do well, go to school, come back and serve in a humble way. But I think that awakening right after serving in elected office is that you have a voice. So what are we really going to use it for and how are we going to use it? So excited to be part of this conversation, Vanessa. Thank you again. And we'll continue.
Yes. And tell me briefly, if you can, what work are you working on now at Nature for All that has you the most excited about the future impact?
I would say, so Nature for All is a nonprofit organization, as you mentioned, that really has traditionally worked on the protection of public lands. It was around as a coalition since 2008. It was key with the coalition work to designate the San Gabriel Mountains as a national monument under President Obama's administration. And I think what me personally coming in 1 year in, it continues to be building that strong community advocacy base, right? If Nature for All doesn't exist in a year or two or even further, we have individuals in their own communities that are learning about what does it mean to have access to a park? What does it mean to advocate for quality water? Climate resiliency is something that we're going to be adding to our curriculum soon. But I really do say that leadership development, looking at those stewards that are either the mom and grandmother who are active in their local parent center, to that local graduate, high school and college that say, I'm studying biology, but I really don't know what to do with it, right? And really introducing them to careers in the field, either conservation, green careers, environmental justice. So I think knowledge is power. That's something that folks say on a regular basis, but in this case, especially in this field, I really do think it's true, right? Being introduced to what's possible and how you belong and can bring your assets and your experience to the table.
That's wonderful. And so incredibly excited to continue talking about some of that work.
And Vanessa, I know I start to interrupt. I know I focused on leadership development, but it's really the access piece, right? Like, what do we do with it next? And,
right.
and how do we belong in certain spaces? So I'll jump into that a little later, but.
Excellent. Yeah, that pipeline is so important. And I do want to hear more about that. So thank you. And now we're going to spotlight Dr. Mendez. Dr. Michael Mendez is an assistant professor of environmental planning and policy at the University of California, Irvine. Hello. He's a visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He most recently served as the inaugural James and Mary Pinchot, I hope I said that right, faculty fellow in sustainable studies and associate research scientist at the Yale School of the Environment. Michael has more than a decade of senior level experience in the public and private sectors where he consulted and actively engaged in policymaking. This included working for the California State Legislature as a senior consultant, lobbyist, and a member of the California State Mining and Geology Board. Also as vice chair of the Sacramento City Planning Commission. In 2021, California Governor Gavin Newsom appointed Dr. Mendez to the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Board. The board regulates water quality for over 11 million people. Dr. Mendez' award-winning book, Climate Change from the Streets, published by Yale University Press, provides an urgent and timely analysis of the contentious politics of incorporating environmental justice into global climate change policy. The book was awarded the Harold and Margaret Sprout Award by the International Studies Association, which is given to the best book in the field of international environmental studies and politics. Last year, Dr. Mendez became the first Latino scholar to win the National Academies of Sciences Henry and Brina David Endowment Award for his wildfire and migrant research. The endowment annually recognizes one leading researcher who has drawn insights from the behavioral and social sciences to inform public policy. And this was just announced yesterday. Dr. Mendez has been named the 2022 Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Each year, the Andrew Carnegie Fellows Program recognizes a very select group of extraordinary scholars and writers who receive philanthropic support for scholarship in the humanities and social sciences that address important and enduring issues confronting our society. Dr. Mendez will receive a $200,000 grant for a research sabbatical to complete his book. We don't know what it's going to be entitled, I believe. Oh, we do have a title. We do. Undocumented Disasters, Invisible Communities Confronting Climate Change and Environmental Justice, which will also be in preparation for the Yale University Press. This fellowship is one of the most prestigious awards for individuals in academics, journalism, and activists, and national thought leaders. It's the next best thing to the MacArthur Genius Fellowship. So we are very happy. Congratulations, Dr. Mendez. And finally, I also want to share that we're honored to have Dr. Mendez on ABC's board of directors. Welcome, Dr. Mendez. That was a bit of a long intro, but a lot to share there.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with a Goldman Award winner and executive director of a leading conservation group. Particularly, we know in our environmental field, people that look like us, people that are people of color, that are women, are queer or others are not at the forefront of the traditional mainstream environmental movement. So it's such an honor to be with such leading practitioners and national thought leaders. So thank you for this opportunity. Highlighting, this is the second event that I've done that's focused on Latinos during Earth Day month. Last week, I was at NALEO, the National Association of Latino and Appointed Elected Officials, helping moderate a roundtable on climate-induced disasters and emergency planning, and really talking about how can we look this at a national, local level, particularly for Latino communities nationwide, where you can't say the word climate change, where maybe they're the only policymaker that on a city council that is Latino. So it's great to be here today, and really look forward to the opportunity to talk and engage with you.
Thank you. Dr. Mendez, can you tell us a little bit about your personal journey to the field of environmental justice and research? Because this is a very specific pathway that you've chosen. What is it that brought you to this?
Great, thank you. And I think that this idea of doing this environmental biography is quite important. In particular, acknowledging our positionality and how our values influence the environmental policy making process. Even if you're a scientist, an economist, or other type of expert, we all bring in our own perspectives. And we really need to acknowledge that and bring in a local knowledge, embodied knowledge, lived experience, to be valued alongside with other experts. So I really came to this environmental justice and environmental policy field from that embodied experience. I grew up in Northeast San Fernando Valley here in Los Angeles County, in the areas of Lake Buteris, Silmar, and Pacoima, where I saw individuals confronting environmental threats on a daily basis. One of the first early memories I remember is living in Lake Buteris, next to, very close to the Lopez Canyon landfill, an existing municipal landfill site that they were trying to expand and extend the life of that landfill after making many promises to close it. And I saw community activists really step up and try to halt that expansion and for the closure of that landfill. Ultimately, that campaign failed, but it really instilled in me the power of community voices. But about 10 or 15 years later, they eventually did able to close that Lopez Canyon landfill, get it remediated, and create it to a green and recreational space. Another aspect is my mother, who went to local area schools in that Northeast San Fernando Valley, again, a largely working class Latino and African American community, wanted me to have better educational opportunities. And she put me in a voluntary school busing program aimed to integrate our schools. And so I was bused to the West San Fernando Valley. Many of you that are older generation or watch Nick at Night may know this area as the Brady Bunch. And back a couple of years ago, 20 or so years ago or more, that area was primarily white and very wealthy. And so I would wake up every morning, get on the school bus at 6 o'clock or a little after there, and slowly see how my urban environments change from unpaved streets and sidewalks, sometimes not even having lights and not having green space, to really see the changes of how these areas had the environmental privilege that Latino communities didn't have in terms of parks, large homes, clean streets, very well-maintained physical infrastructure of the streets. So that really awakened me to understand why these urban disparities existed. And that led me to study urban environmental planning as an undergraduate, later on as a master's student at MIT, and eventually a PhD student. And before I entered into my PhD studies, I worked in the California State Legislature for one of my area assembly members, Cindy Montañez, and worked on these environmental justice issues because she wanted to have somebody that understood the issues and to help work on environmental policy and legislation to have a strong equity lens.
And someone that was from the community, right? And had that
Yes,
exposure, right? That's key. That's wonderful. I wonder, Dr. Mendez, if you can share with us this new book that you will be working on, and I know we're going to dive into it a little bit more later, but what is it just broadly that you're hoping to achieve, and lessons learned from your first book that you would either like to enhance or expand upon?
Yeah, so my new research looks broadly at how undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants are being first and hardest hit from climate-induced disasters such as wildfires, heat waves, drought, or the compounding of other hazards that are happening simultaneously. Yes, Latinos, in general, and African Americans, people of color, are first and hardest hit disproportionately. But I wanted to focus on some of the most stigmatized and marginalized or voiceless populations, undocumented migrants, in particular Indigenous Mexican and Central American migrants, which are often homogenized with Spanish-speaking Latinos, and really showing the disparities in the everyday lives of the environmental inequities, social and economic inequities that exist. And when a disaster like wildfires strike, and only exacerbates existing inequalities and creates this form of hyper marginalization for this population. So I'm going to be investigating that and this idea of climate migration and how these individuals are experiencing it in their home countries, in Mexico and Central America, climate impacts, they come to the United States, and again are at the forefront because of their socioeconomic status of the impacts of climate change. So climate change is obviously a global issue that follows individuals disproportionately as they move from one place to the other.
Fascinating. This is so interesting. I want to pause now, and I want to be able to bring in our other panelists so we can speak more in greater detail on some of this work and the connection between this work, these issues, and the impacts that they have on health and on education issues. So with that, I'd love to bring in the others. We have a wonderful Zoom wizard who's facilitating and making this a lot easier. Welcome to the panel. Can you all see him, everyone? Yes, great. So this is a question for any one of you to please take. I'd like to start with the COVID pandemic and how it has amplified environmental injustices for Latinos in Los Angeles. How have you seen this in your work? And this is open to anyone.
Yeah, I could definitely jump in. You know, as a movement that's really based on bringing folks together, having everybody in isolation represents a real challenge, right? Like, how do you build these relationships? How do you build community when folks are literally can't come outside, right? And so I think there was a lot of surprises for us in ways that were really strengthened our movement, right? I think the interest in folks participating more and in deeper ways increased as folks were kind of stuck at home, right? So folks were feeling the need to engage, the need to connect, and that was happening through our membership spaces, right? I think one of the biggest kind of lessons learned that I think we're thinking about more broadly now is we had developed a decentralized community garden based in people's homes, right? And this was in response to a fight because they wanted to build a Walmart in the city of Commerce, right? There's no market in the city of Commerce. And so if we're gonna fight a company that can provide some produce, then we got to provide produce for our community, right? And that was the impetus for our decentralized community garden. Also because all the land is contaminated, so we can't do like a traditional community garden, right, on an industrial site. That just doesn't work. So we started growing home food in people's homes, right? So when the pandemic hit, some of our organizers were supporting our members accessing food banks, but very quickly all fresh produce was gone. So folks were only getting dried foods, folks were only getting canned foods. And so because we already had this decentralized community garden, we started dedicating the produce coming out of our gardens to supplement the food bank food for our members, right? And so when we conceptualized this decentralized community garden that we call La Cosecha Colectiva, we weren't anticipating a global pandemic, but because we had already started to address the very real systemic issues in our communities, the catastrophes that are our everyday reality, it helped us be more prepared for a global pandemic. And so that's how we're starting to think more about different aspects of our work and opportunities to build community-centered and decentralized infrastructure for climate responses.
And it goes back to how we are showing up for one another, right? How, especially in that moment, community was really able to step up and serve one another and be there for one another.
Yeah, and I think it really builds off of already existing community knowledge, right? A lot of our folks know how to grow food. A lot of folks in our homelands or even coming here have that experience. And so, you know, really looking at the existing relationships we have with the land to provide for each other.
That's so true, so true. Other responses?
Yeah, for us, Vanessa, you know, I came in mid-pandemic and the team was already operating virtually. We had to really work with our community ambassadors to get them up to speed with laptops, training how to use these Zoom functions and really increase their capacity and their skill set to continue to do the work, right? Nothing was going to shut the team down to continue to be those advocates and to really move forward in our work. However, it was challenging, right? Because a lot of our coalition members did say, we're competing against basic needs, right? We're competing against folks needing to be on the line to get a COVID vaccine, on the line to get fresh food, as Mark just mentioned. And, you know, we understood that maybe public land protection wasn't the topic that folks were interested in during the pandemic. However, when we started talking about, you know, are you accessing your local park?
Right.
And finding that, for example, yeah, the soccer field was available, but it was locked. You know, that gate was locked. And how were we going to then get in touch with those council members at various cities, from the city of LA to the smaller cities in the San Gabriel Valley and Southeast LA as well, to make sure that access was available. So I think not only did that inspire us to move that type of advocacy in a different lens as we've done it previously, but it also opened up the opportunity for more participation. When traditionally we had the community-based building trainings in San Fernando Valley, San Gabriel Valley, and Southeast LA, mostly Huntington Park, the Huntington Park, Compton region, we started seeing folks signing on to our courses or trainings from the Wilmington area, from the Harbor Bay area, from Orange County even. So the need to have this type of, advocacy, training, education, in my opinion, was key. We started seeing a lot more attention to open space advocacy at the state level as well, with the 30 by 30 movement, with Outdoors for All. And I'll go into this a little bit further, which I feel we're very fortunate to have, resources coming to our community through outdoor equity grants. My question is it sustainable? Will it be part of that budget item in the future? And again, it's a way that, we know parks offer the fresh air, the exercise, the well-being, mental health aspects that we all need, especially during the pandemic. But we also got to see that Latino workers were the ones who were most hard hit. They had to work.
Right.
They did not have the luxury to think of sometimes what park is close to me so that I can go and enjoy it with my kids that, they're on Zoom all day.
Right.
So I know that's a luxury that many of us do experience and do have access to. So I saw it in that way and really began having those conversations with our team, right? Like, who do we want to be? Nature for all, right? And really wanting to continue to serve, especially our underserved communities, traditionally, historically, experiencing these environmental racist activities that are a reality for many.
Right. And, my next question was going to be on how the two, environmental issues and mental health, are related, but I think you've touched on that, right? I mean, you've spoken a bit about that. The priorities of getting outside, how people take refuge to being in the outdoors, how for some family members, there were no other options but to go to a park or to visit a beach when the beaches were open. And even then, the challenges of being able to get around, right? Transportation and so on. Does anybody want to add anything around the importance of being able to prioritize the access of these spaces and the benefits that they have on mental health?
I did want to touch a little bit on environmental issues and mental health, because I think, like I mentioned earlier, so many of the issues that we face are normalized and internalized, right? And so I kind of link it to ethnic studies, right? To like folks taking their first Chicano studies class and being like, oh, damn, I'm starting to understand my experience. Right? When a lot of folks get into the movement and start understanding like, oh, damn, there's train tracks right behind my house. Yo, why is there this factory that's letting out smoke behind my school all the time? It always smells. Right? Why? And start making those connections. We start to understand our lived experiences. We start to understand why we have asthma, why we have asthma attacks, why our kids are facing these issues. And in a lot of ways, becoming aware of these issues, of these systems, humanizes us, right? Because a lot of times, the impacts that we face, we internalize them, right? So just going back a little bit, I remember Prop 187 and seeing commercials on TV where they were talking about, it's because of their Aztec blood, that's why they're violent, or the parents don't care about school, that's why they're not doing well. Meanwhile, we're getting poisoned by lead that impacts, our ability to achieve in school and rates of violence and crime in communities, right? And so a lot of what I think becoming aware of these issues offers us is understanding our own experiences and our own agency.
Yeah, and you certainly, I mean, just on this panel alone have done that, have taken the personal experiences and that outrage, frustration, the curiosity, the knowledge has been manifested in in the movements and the research that has contributed to the movements. I want to ask Dr. Mendez, we just touched on mental health and impacts of that from environmental issues. What are some other issue areas that are not necessarily seen as environmental issues at first glance?
First, I just want to touch really quickly on the mental health issue. And I think in general, in our Latino community, we really don't talk about mental health issues and about mindfulness. And when we're experiencing these forms of compounding disasters, it's COVID-19 pandemic is not happening in isolation of hazardous air quality, smoke events, heat waves, and how continually these Latino communities are experiencing these multiple forms of disasters that are happening simultaneously, and they're experiencing this form of disaster fatigue or PTSD from these multiple disasters that are happening. If they're migrant agricultural workers to even urban Latinos that are experiencing that, and really pushing a course for health, increased healthcare coverage that includes mental health services, but also how being in the outdoors, mindfulness, having that experience to be out in these clean green spaces is quite important to the overall well-being of a Latino individual, as well as our communities in general. So I just wanted to add that because I've really seen that in my research, this PTSD and trauma that Latinos, particularly those of low socioeconomic status, experiencing from these compounding of disasters. But going into your question about what other issues do we think that we don't commonly think about, one of the biggest issues that we're experiencing is heat waves, particularly in urban areas, the urban heat island effect, that these urban areas are quite warmer than other areas because we're all asphalt and concrete with very little green space. And even looking down on that, even further, our schools, which is very important to our organization ABC, about how utilitarian, how brutalist many of our schools, particularly in low-income communities, are made, all concrete. I don't know, I think we all have memories of playing here in Los Angeles, playing outside, and you can literally see the steam steeping out of the tar and asphalt, and yeah. Our schools still look like that. And so there's been initiatives from environmental groups and with the new superintendent to adopt a green infrastructure plan for our LAUSD schools and hopefully other school districts and throughout California, and making them green, making them multi-purpose, not only providing green space, recreational space, but also recharging our groundwater and ensuring that we have multiple forms of the green investments. So I think that's one key thing that's really important to the mission of the ABC and our school education, is integrating an environmental agenda in our education as well, and the education of our children.
And ensuring that the funding, the unprecedented public resources that are coming down the pipeline are covering that. I don't know if somebody else would like to touch on this.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that, I think especially with the Exide issue, really with all of the contamination issues that we face, but Exide for us has really highlighted how intersectional all these issues are, right? We can't talk about lead poisoning without talking about early education for our children, right? Without talking about the impacts it has on schooling, which of course goes into school funding, right? How big are our classrooms? What type of support systems do we have for our children, right? We can't talk about lead contamination without talking about over-policing of our communities, right? Because if it's impacting impulse control and impulse control is impacting, rates of crime and violence, then what types of programs are we implementing for youth employment? What types of programs are we implementing to reintegrate our community members who are coming out of the system, right? The response is over policing, right? The response is shoving more of our children into smaller classrooms, right? These things are really tied together. And so I would dare to say that there's no issues that are disconnected from the environmental issues that we face in our communities.
And I can just add, Vanessa, really quickly. I mean, 3 weeks ago, we took out a group of students from Southgate to beautiful San Pedro, California, right? And in talking to one of the students, they said, I hadn't been to a field trip in 4 years. I haven't been to the beach, said another, in my life. And I think, the connection that we like to make at Nature for All is, it's not just about sign this petition and help us protect these open and green spaces, it's about really informing you and educating folks on what do you have locally? How does that tie into your local watershed? How does that impact, the pollutions coming into our community?
Right.
And then where does this come from? So I have to say, I mean, even as a former elected, and Mark, you're saying so much that is not only inspiring me, but it's also making me feel like, gosh, we don't have these conversations where we need to have them, right? As a former elected, it is difficult. You have 5 people. You can't act alone. You can inspire, you can move forward. I was focused a lot on the finance. So for example, it's public in Southgate, the staff was looking to finance or refinance our water fund. Yet we had already been overcharging our residents to say, why are we going to get into more debt when we haven't fixed what we have? Use what we have, fix it first, lower the interest rate, but I don't want the kids 20 years from now to be worried about paying this, right? Because that is going to impact their focus. Their focus is going to be on, on debt that is already a burden on a daily basis for them. So I could just say, making that connection for individuals, and it's not a one touch. It's not a field trip. It's going back to the school and saying, hey, let's follow up with a conversation about that. Now let's look at what's in your local community and how can we enhance that as well? Because the reality is we can't always have funding to do these nature trips or all aboard to nature, but we can inform folks of what is there for them to enjoy and really have them access it and really start changing that conversation in their own families.
And I'm so glad you're touching on that, because it's a great segue into the next piece, which is about advocacy, right? Engaging, mobilizing, organizing. Tell us how, in your perspectives, how have Latinos been left out of these spaces, and how have they been left out of the conversations when it comes to advocacy work?
Real quick, Vanessa, I just wanted to go back because it's really inspired by what you're saying, Belen. And just thinking about how profound it is for you to be in the leadership position of the organization, for these kids from Southgate to see themselves in you, go on this trip and come back home with you coming back home. That's hugely important, right? I think when a lot of traditional outdoors types programs have been very much like, let's get these kids out of their community, right? Like, let's kind of rescue them. And you're taking it the other way of, this is about building commitment here. Right. This is about building investment in our community, not just financially, but in our actual community members who are going to love our community and are going to want to make it better. Right. Like, that's so important when we're talking about representation, and representation isn't everything, right? Because there's tons of brown folks all over the world that are doing terrible things. But it's important to recognize the impact that has. Right. So I just really wanted to lift that up.
Thank you, Mark. That really is. And this panel is a reflection of that, right? Is coming back and really going through with extreme force on how we're making these systems better and how we're engaging our future leaders to continue to carry the banner. So thank you for pausing us there. I do want to ask, how do we continue to grow that power and that advocacy work? So instead of asking how have our Latinos been left out of these conversations, I'm going to change it and say, how do we continue to increase the engagement of Latinos and developing the next generation of leaders when it comes to this type of work?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it really truly is education. Right. I didn't study environmental justice in my undergrad years or whatnot. I experienced it obviously growing up. I remember the steam from the asphalt. I remember not having shade when we would walk down Tweedy Boulevard, right, to, I don't know, go visit the local raspado place, whatever it was. So all of that definitely, impacts how you think of yourself and what you think you deserve and what you think you're entitled to. Like Mark said, you're not aware of it until someone introduces you to it. And, I have to say that education is the piece from starting small to, what is conservation? to introducing someone to the iNaturalist app to be aware of, what's happening in my own community. Do I, what native plants, what flora and fauna is here? We don't have those conversations. I never had those conversations growing up. I grew up with cornfields in front of my home because that's what my father had access to, chiles, tomates, everything, you name it. But when it comes to this larger professional setting of environment and conservation, it's not something that we're traditionally exposed to. So for me, it's going to be, through our leadership development, through our community-based building trainings, whoever and everyone that we can reach, and pairing it with actual trips to nature, local and outside, so that they feel they belong too. It's not just having access. It's then once you're there, do you feel that you belong? Because there are beaches here in California that people still don't want you there. No matter, if you don't look like them, they don't want you there. So how do we change that? By being there, by having that access and making it happen. So I go back to education and building community that way as well.
And I do love there's a comment by Lydia Costa Stevens from LA Unified about education, critical analysis, problem solving, and collaborative conversations, which you all represent, right? Any additional comments on this one before I move on?
Sure. I would just reiterate, I think it's education, it's engagement. How do we make these issues real? How do we make climate change real? How do we make environmental issues real? And understand that climate change is happening in our streets, in our backyard, and climate change or environmental issues is not out there in the wilderness, but it's interconnected. I think there's always that misnomer that we don't look at the things that are happening in our immediate surrounding. And I just want to add is just like people come to these issues through real experience. Their experience, like as Belen and Mark have mentioned, they experience firsthand some of these environmental injustice. And I don't know if this is the universe trying to tell me something, but this is the third time the issue of Southgate has come into my sphere in the last 2 weeks. First, I taught about it in class about the Delta, the Delta Airlines dumping of jet fuel over I don't know how many area schools between Southgate and Cudahy. And we were talking about that. Is this an environmental injustice issue? Have these communities become sort of a sacrifice zones in terms of the airport pass, but also for that illegal dumping of the fuel? And then I went to the Nanaleo conference, and one of your I guess, former council members, Denise and Diaz was there, and then really talking about that and sort of the issues, how that has impacted multiple students, teachers, and community members. So again, obviously, that's a horrible event that's still ongoing, but hopefully that has inspired individuals to really understand that these acts are not by coincidence. The way our communities look, the way that they're planned, that historic disinvestment, our crumbling infrastructure is not by chance. It's political choices that have been made for generations that are causing these systemic injustices in our Latino communities and other communities of color.
Yeah, just to jump in on that too, I think the key that I've seen from doing a bunch of door knocking, right, doing tons of classroom presentations, the key is getting folks to understand that what we experience is not normal. It's just been normalized, right? That's the key, because once you develop the understanding that our current existence is natural, right, that these systems that literally allow for the poisoning of our bodies, the poisoning of the land, of the air, of the water, and of course our bodies, is not natural. Those are decisions being made. That all the infrastructure that exists, the 710 freeway is not natural, right? That is part of a transportation plan for the state of California. Once you realize all of those things are plans, the possibility that we can change the plans opens up, right? That possibility. And that's the key. The moment you get the sense that something else that's different is possible, you will be compelled to do something about it, right? And I think that, which of course is based in education, right? And that's those of us who are going door to door, that's, a bunch of ECR members are educators working in our public schools. Some of them starting to develop curriculum that's based on the issues that we're working on, right? So that the youth can plug right in, right? And even if we don't have the answer now, they're going to be the ones that have the answer in 10 years, 20 years, right? And so those types of investments are really critical. That investment in youth in particular is really critical to even establish the potential for a possible different future for our communities.
Yeah, Mark, and as you're speaking, I always heard of people talking about our communities as so resilient, and we are, right? But I think, now I'm unlearning that as a term, because yes, we are resilient, y somos luchadores, and that's why we're going to continue to fight and do well for our communities and our children and our families. We can go on and on, but it's about, not normalizing it, right? And I was on the council when the Delta dump happened. And, at that time, I personally and other colleagues were asking for a workforce development program for our community. We have LAX just 20 minutes away from us. Can they be the next aviators? Can they be the next, pilots, mechanics that are working, that are going to have access to those high growth career jobs? And, I didn't get reelected, and that's okay. But later I find that all they're offering are fruit trees. And I said, no, this is BS. That this is environmental racism. Why is the flight path where it was, right? There was no data at the congressional level on how many dumps were happening in the community. And that to me was so offensive, because that showed me that it didn't matter. Yet if it was the 210 freeway, you bet they would have had that data. So, it's definitely an awakening for me personally. And I think, being on the council was a true privilege. At the same time, though, you're learning as you go. You have city managers, you have the city staff really going through the process. And, you're introduced to NEPA, CEQA, all these different processes, but it's not really something they want you to know about so much. And they're great people. Trust me, they're great people, professional. But at the end of the day, it is education. It is asking questions. It is unlearning the terminology that, makes us proud to be resilient and move forward. But at the same time, let me question why a little further. And let me have those collaborative conversations that need to happen to really move something forward, because being one person is not going to be enough. And Mark.
Thank you, Belen. Mark, go right ahead.
Yeah, I think you raised that really good point. And from that particular perspective, Belen, around what were staff communicating to you as an elected official? And we see this all the time from agency staff, right? Where oftentimes too much community engagement, too many community members showing up to a community meeting, that's a problem. It's more of checking the box and moving things forward. So oftentimes what they're telling our decision makers is based on an agenda of just trying to move forward, right? So the data they will share reflects things are happening right and happening on time and happening in budget, right? Without the nuance and the detail of what our communities are actually experiencing on the ground. And so, this workforce development piece is really key. And that's something that with the Exide cleanup, we've been very successful at fighting for, with 40% of the cleanup workers coming from our community, because they're going to want to clean up our communities right. They're not going to want to cut the corners. They're not going to want to leave that contamination there, because that's their neighbor, that's their family member, that's their friend, right? And those are the folks who are speaking up to say, hey, you know what? This supervisor is telling us to cut corners. This supervisor is telling us to disregard protocols, right? And that provides us the opportunity to come in to make sure the cleanup is happening right. So again, the opportunity for our folks to be in these positions to do this work is critically important, right? And when we're talking about environmental cleanups, you could go to any of our neighborhoods and find the need for toxic environmental cleanup, right? So these are important opportunities that we can make sure that if there's funding, if there's public funding going to this, it needs to be beneficial to our community members too.
Right. Thank you for that. We have about 15 more minutes and I have a slew of questions, but I'm not gonna be able to ask them all. I want to make sure that we get some questions from the audience because they've already been listed in the chat. But I do want to end with one more question on the subject of the importance of engagement. Mark, can you tell us about East Yard's Green Zones project and how organizing efforts have propelled the initiative?
Yeah, so the idea for green zones goes pretty far back. I want to say at least what year are we in right now? Maybe 15 years or so. And it really comes from this issue of we're having to fight facility by facility, right? Every new project that wants to pop up in our community, we're trying to stop it, right? With the idea being we're beyond our threshold for what our communities can handle as far as toxic pollution, right? And so what green zones moves us towards is creating buffer zones around our sensitive areas, our schools, our homes, our parks, right? To ensure that those types of toxic facilities just aren't allowed in those zones. They're not going to be our neighbors. I don't have to share my fence line with a chrome plater, right? So that then we're able to shift our energy, right? And stop focusing so much on fighting facility by facility and start working to improving, like what was mentioned, right? Just transition, workforce development, and really starting to change our communities in those ways. So we've, in the City of Commerce, we were able to get the city to approve the first ever green zones in the nation, which is huge, right? For a tiny city of commerce. And often a lot of the Southeast LA cities, right? There's tons of amazing things happening, but just don't get the recognition as if a city like LA or a city like Long Beach that are much larger are going to get, right? And then we were able to get it approved by the county in the unincorporated zones, which again are some of the most dumped on areas of Los Angeles, right? And so right now we're in the phase of working with the county on implementation of the green zones policies moving forward. But even in the phase where we were developing the policies, we were already starting to use the language to stop terrible projects along the way or to shut down existing polluters, right? Because the political investment was there. The supervisors, the county supervisors were already invested in green zones even before the policy passed, right? And so it really does take that long-term community, if we're talking about 15 years, right? That long-term community investment in advancing the future vision of our communities, along with the agency staff, right, the public employees, the elected officials really coming on board to move it forward.
It works, right? In other words, it works and it can work, which is really important to highlight. Dr. Mendez, your book, Climate Change from the Streets, it explores the perspectives and influence low-income people of color bring to their advocacy work on climate change. Can you share a little bit more about this work with us?
Great. So this book, what it started as and what it ended up are two very different things. What it ended up being is essentially this environmental history book of Latino and African American and other people of color leading on climate change. Oftentimes when we hear this global narrative of California being having leadership on environmental and climate change issues, and that carries around, if you go to United Nations conference meetings, other countries always see California as leader, but that strong equity lens, that strong fact that Latino legislators in particular are leading and have been, and essentially inserting themselves, if they're wanted there or not, on to be some of the key leaders on climate change issues and putting that strong justice equity lens. So I really told that book from that perspective. There's been other books. In particular, there was another book that came a year out before, that was published by another major academic press. It got all these awards about California's environmental history from the 1800s to modern day times with climate change. And people of color I mentioned twice in the entire book, and it's one or two sentences. So that really angered me. So I made my book with people of color at the forefront of this environmental movement, from legislators and obviously to the environmental justice organizations, leading and creating more equitable climate change programs. And I often say that while I'm very supportive of the Green New Deal, there's nothing new about the Green New Deal, because environmental justice groups in California in particular have been pushing for that equity, public health, economic justice or co-benefits lens for almost 20 years. And California has been that hotbed of what we see is happening with the Biden administration, their Justice 40, which is basically not word for word, but basically is implementing some of the achievements that environmental justice groups have won in California to the national level. So my book tells that kind of 20-year history of people of color, legislators, and more importantly, EJ groups pushing forward for an equity and justice lens in climate and environmental policy.
I love how you said, I'm going to write my own book, right? Basically, that's what's out there. And that's what I hear from each of you, right? In your own work is we're going to do it to fit our communities. We're going to do it engaging our communities, and we're going to do it with our insight and our experiences and our expertise at the table, because that's how we find solutions that are actually appropriate for a community. I want to ask one
real
question.
quick, Vanessa,
Yeah, go for it.
Touch on that, because I think what Michael's bringing up is so important, right? And I often tell folks, right, like, my grandparents didn't learn about John Muir, and they were like, oh, we should fight this prison, we should fight this oil pipeline under our neighborhood, we should fight this toxic waste incinerator, right? The youth in our communities that we're organizing aren't seeing tweets from Greta Thunberg and being like, oh, I'm inspired, right? We're fighting because it's in our faces. We're fighting because we have no other choice but to fight. We have to fight, right? But the way that we do this fighting, the way we come together, the way we build community is based on our culture, right? It's based on our ability to come together. It's based on our experiences with large family networks. It's based on our indigenous teachings from our homelands, right? All of that informs how we do this, right? Which is radically different. And so many more stories, like what Michael has been able to put forward, right? So many more stories need to be told.
Yeah, and just one quick thing, and the new research I'm doing on disasters and undocumented migrants, particularly the journal publications and the public-facing work, I co-author it with some of these indigenous migrant rights groups and environmental justice groups in the Central Coast and in Northern California that are at the forefront of these wildfires. And for them to tell the stories, I think is important for these individuals that are representing some of these marginalized populations, be able to have that platform to speak for themselves. And obviously, being an academic, we collaborate to provide mutual credibility. But it's important, oftentimes these communities, particularly if they're in indigenous migrant rights or a migrant rights organization, are not involved typically on environmental issues, but they're pushed and thrust into these environmental justice issues because climate change, and it's now migrant rights groups are becoming environmental groups because they're forced to, not because they wanted to, but they're forced to because there oftentimes is no government services. There's a governmental gap that doesn't provide any safeguarding for these communities. So I think really being able to tell these stories, provide all our lived experiences and get it validated and used in the policymaking process is important.
Yes, and I want to touch on some of the victories too. We can't leave this panel conversation without talking about some of the victories and also how people can get involved. And please keep your eyes on the chat. We are going to be adding some links in there. But Lynn, a huge victory. Obviously, President Obama came to the San Gabriel Mountains and had a huge signing ceremony with the victory that was led by the Nature for All Coalition. Can you talk about that? Briefly touch on the, there's gonna be a picture, look at that, how wonderful. And that there's members of the, you can't see it, it's cropped out, but in red too, members of the coalition that were there for the signing. Can you also touch on the 1,000,000 acres in California bill that Senator Padilla is currently holding and carrying, and also some of the federal funding support that you're getting for some exciting programs?
Most definitely excited to shine some light on work that happened before me and those that came before me at Nature for All. It was a true collaborative effort. Coalition members from COFEM, Active SGV, Amigos de los Rios, many others at Day One. I have a list here, APIFM Forward Movement, that were part of this advocacy, quite honestly, to say we care, the urban interface, neighboring 70% of our open space in the San Gabriel Mountains, cares to protect this land. So they fought, since early 2000, mid 2000s. And in 2014, the victory happened where Obama declared it, designated it as a national monument. What does that mean, right? The US forest is underfunded. So even though we have the blessing to have it be a national monument, we're seeing and experiencing that, we still need to do more. So the Public Lands Act that Senator Alex Padilla is championing is really allowing the discussion to be, let's further protect the wilderness areas, the rivers, and add a national recreation area that extends down into the urban community, right? So off the 605 corridor. There are some challenges in this Congress. We don't know if we're going to see this move forward, but it doesn't mean the fight stops. I mean, it's been going on for 10 years. As mentioned, Mark and Michael earlier, these things take time, and we're hoping to see some movement in the next Congress. In the meantime, though, champions that are in DC continue to highlight the importance of access and protection of these lands. So Congresswoman Chu, longtime champion, as well as those that came before her, right? Supervisor Solis, when she was in Congress, who established the Rivers and Mountains Conservancy as an example, has provided Nature for All with a congressional appropriation of almost $1 million. This is out of her commitment to see access actually happen. What does that look like? It looks like a shuttle program where Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy as well has invested in seeing a concept design where we have shuttles leaving from the metro systems in Pasadena and Azusa that can then lead folks into the forest. Again, it could be accessible for those that are maybe in the San Gabriel Valley, maybe East LA, downtown LA area. But when you're looking at folks from Wilmington, Southeast LA, that's a 2-hour metro ride.
Right.
It's not going to happen. So at the same time, we're continuing to work on our community transit where, we're looking at direct trips from folks' communities into nature. So we're very excited about.
So exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa.
Yes. I want to ask one last question of each of you. What more needs to be done to ensure and secure that philanthropy and government resources are available and are expanding and growing to support the work that you all are doing as leaders of organizations that are serving Latino communities and people of color, and also as Latino leaders yourselves? What more needs to be done?
Yeah, I can continue really quickly. What more needs to be done? I think for sure, not seeing our county, although they serve and do a great work, no longer work in silos. LA County has chosen to tax themselves. You have Measure W, you have Measure H, Measure A, Measure M, WHAM, right? They call it. How are they going to work together to make multi-benefit projects that are going to be like the urban orchard in Southgate? I'm going back to Southgate still, where you're not only recycling stormwater, or stormwater capture recycling, but you're also creating a space that's green, that's going to create passive recreation opportunities, an orchard for food. How are we making sure that other cities are benefiting? What technical assistance are they offering to the smaller city that can't afford a consultant to be on top of those applications? And then at the state level, I think let's see us on that budget line, right? We see conservation, we see climate change, we see so many things, and we'll see a package, I think, after tomorrow, right, as we're discussing it in Sacramento. But is equitable access, is this going to be a continuous effort that they're going to fund? And I want to see it. Why? Because we can't take someone on a trip without a lunch, right? And a lot of these programs do not fund those aspects. They just fund your staff time. But how realistic is that for an organization to push forward? So really quickly, and I know it'll come up in the announcements, we're fortunate to be part of the Lower LA River pilot River Ranger pilot program that the Watershed Conservation Authority is kicking off, along with other partners, River in LA, it's coming up, as well as the various cities there. Sacred Places Institute is also really making sure that we're collaborating to ensure that we're talking about those untold stories that traditionally we have not, right? Because I have to say, even as a former elected, a land acknowledgement wasn't something that was a custom. And it is disrespectful, right? To not know the history of the places that we belong in and how they've changed traditionally. So if you're in town, if you're in the area, join us, this Saturday at 10 a.m. in Hollandale Park. That's just one aspect of our program, but our goal there would be to continue with our education, community-based building trainings, our leadership academy, work along the river. And I know there are organizations that are doing amazing work already. And I look forward to partnering with each and every one of you, because as I've told all of our coalition members and even those outside of the coalition, there's so much work for all of us to do. Right. That even if all the funding becomes available, it's not going to be enough. So.
Right. Thank you for that. Dr. Mendez and Mark, thoughts about what philanthropy can do and how we can ensure there are sufficient government resources for supporting these efforts?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think funding, obviously, right? Like that's the number one way to ensure our communities have the resources to do the work we need to do. I think the type of funding is critically important, right? Because the reality is when you look at, mainstream environmental organizations, right? There's tons of funding, right? They're the ones that are pulling in, massive donations for climate change and all these things, but their work isn't necessarily in our communities, right? And so I think that's critically important for those in philanthropy who are investing in our communities to start to reach out to their colleagues who are not funding our communities, right? Who are funding these kind of mainstream, even international organizations, to really put the money on the ground. That's where it's making the most impact, right? And I think general operating dollars, right? If the money is too narrow, then it's hard for us to do our work because it's intersectional, right? The River Ranger program was just brought up. Right. We sat as East Yard on the Lower LA River Revitalization Plan, and we brought up using River Rangers instead of police, because River Rangers, have the opportunity to engage with our community in programmatic ways, not just policing, right? And that is what led to the bill that led to the programs now, right? But without our communities at the table bringing up the multitude of concerns, that's not going to happen, right? And so general operating dollars really allow us to be agile when we're creating possibility for our communities, right? So I think that's really key to kind of continuing to grow the work that we've been able to do. And like I mentioned earlier, investment in the youth, because they're the ones that are going to take this beyond anything that we can imagine.
Thank you. Dr. Mendez?
I think what both Belen and Mark had mentioned, it's really important and key, and just making sure that we're at the forefront of some of these philanthropic organizations themselves, because some of the philanthropic organizations are not diverse themselves and don't have people of color in some of the leadership and grant making process. And then looking at some of the BIPOC, I can't remember the name of the organization that's been tracking how much money are they actually giving to people of color-led organizations. And for some of the big philanthropic organizations, less than 10%. And some have committed to 10%, but even that is not enough. So I think ensuring that we're at the discussions, both in the public and private sectors, even in philanthropic sectors, where we can have an influence on these issues. So
wonderful. Thank you. There is a couple of questions from the audience. We have enough time for maybe one or two, but we do want to be able to touch on how people can get involved, how more of the work can be supported. So I'm going to ask these last questions from the audience. In a field, this is coming from Sarah Rascon, in a field that has been inequitable since its inception, Where and how do you start to address issues of environmental equity? It's kind of a big one, but a just kind of answer. And Sarah, yeah, go ahead.
I could jump in, and hey, Sarah, it's awesome to see so many folks that we know and collaborate with, being active in the chat. That's the kind of community we've all fostered with each other, right? So that's really dope. As far as how do we address environmental equity, I think part of it, like I mentioned earlier, is sharing the stories, right? I think that's something that Ale, who's being very active in the chat, upon starting to work for ECR, was like, damn, there's so much ECR does that I didn't know, even though I collaborated with ECR, right? And so part of it is really telling our stories. And so really appreciate the work of Michael, really appreciate the stories that Belen shared earlier. I think that's a big part is being able to kind of be visible, right? And so that's maybe a challenge to everybody who's here, who's participating, who's seeing what we're talking about, right? In what ways are we going to commit to making all of this even more visible?
Yeah, I would just echo, come with vulnerability, right? I think, there aren't too many Latinos in the spaces. And you mentioned Sara, who's on the call. I'm not aware of who's exactly on here, but I know she's a first, for example, in her position at, RMC with Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. So it's really being vulnerable to say, welcome, let's connect. Let's talk about our own story and really share why we're here and what we can do together, right? Because I think in my spaces and in this role already, there have been very welcoming spaces where I feel that, and there are others that they just kind of expect you to swim, sink, or swim and not swim, or I don't know. And that's the truth. That's the truth. And I'm just going to say it, right? Because it is what it is. The world is that way. But it has to happen with vulnerable connections and authenticity. Otherwise, I think we're kind of all working in our silos and seeing what happens.
And you all bring that to the table. And I think that's also very unique to Latino communities, is when we are engaging and when we have, whether it's a group of parent leaders or it's working on education issues, immigration issues, health issues, that vulnerability is there and the candor is there. It really just needs to be cultivated more. Dr. Mendez, I don't know if you have any final thoughts on that question.
Sure. I think the biggest issue is understanding, particularly for government organizations and even philanthropic organizations, is moving with the speed of trust. And there's a lot of political expediency, trying to get out the next best policy. And then, as Mark was mentioned earlier, check the box of the community engagements. But building the time to create those relationships between governments and organizations, trusted community organizations in particular. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we see, the lack of willingness of some government organizations to invest that time and understand it. It's going to, for various reasons, there might be distrust of government, but being able to be more collaborative and build that and move with that speed of trust.
I like that, speed of trust. I hadn't heard that before. I'm sorry if I'm skipping questions. I have one that's right in front of me that I'm going to ask, and this will be the last question. How do I get myself being very, very busy to be involved, and how do I encourage or recruit young folks who have more time?
I just threw something in the chat. If you live in the Long Beach area, Compton, Southeast LA, or the East Side, and want to plug in, reach out to info@eycej.org. Again, we have a million things going on. So part of it is finding out, one, your capacity to engage, right? But then two, what are you specifically interested in? And we have membership spaces across our communities that meet once or twice a month. A lot of it virtual because of COVID. So it's just an opportunity to start to build relationships with folks. And sometimes folks don't know what that first step is, right? Like, what's that thing I can do, that thing I can get involved with? And oftentimes it's just saying, what's up?
Right.
Who are you? This is who I am. That is the most important first step.
And I'd like to add is that especially Generation Z and younger millennials are often thinking that their vote doesn't count. But as we know, elections have consequences. They wouldn't be trying to take away the vote from African Americans in Georgia, Latinos in Arizona, and Texas if our individuals' votes didn't count. So I often tell people, when people ask me how can they get involved, I said first be active and engaged in the electoral process if you have the right to vote, and really not voting just on the top of the ticket, the president, U.S. senators, but also our local city council members, our board of supervisors, our water board, or whatever position it may be, because it's always important to know that these individuals have larger political aspirations often, and they're going to be moving up to maybe Congress or the state assembly. And so you should always, even at the local level, ask them specifically what their positions on climate change, on environmental justice, and social justice issues. Because again, these individuals are going to be moving through the political process, and we should be asking these important questions of all our candidates, no matter what office they're running for.
Yeah, and I would say, if I know everyone's busy, but if you want to learn a little bit more and know how to hold that elected accountable, to see that they told you X, that they deliver X in Sacramento or not. Join us at a community-based building training, leadership development training, our leadership academy. I mean, there's just so many tools that folks learn, and it's really inspiring to know that, the lady who was at the Parent Center is now understanding what that budget item means for the city of LA, and making sure that she's in touch with her elected to make sure that, their advocacy made a difference. So again, for sure, at least read. If you can't join something, go online, look at newsletters, look at articles. Prevention Institute has great information. The county, even the 2016 park assessment. I remember being an elected, reading that for the first time. I thought, oh my goodness. Like Mark said, oh my goodness, like that, an opening of this is happening now. So someone asked about organization in South LA. Yeah, there's Link Coalition. There's also Scope. Happy to find them on the online right now and share it. But
yeah, and we will, if you follow us on Twitter, afabc.org, the handles for each are also included. Thank you, Natalia, Twitter and Instagram. I'm also going to put Natalia's email on the chat, who also works in programs with ABC and communications. I'm excited to share that Eastern and ABC will be endeavoring again on another adventure. We were partners in the cash assistance program last year, 2020 and 2021, to get some assistance out to families. And I'm excited to share, we're going to be partnering again in the next few months, and we're exploring specific programs with Nature for All. So do stay connected to ABC. Of course, Dr. Mendez is part of our leadership and helping ABC continue to build out vision and looking to make sure that we are living out the mission day to day. I am so incredibly grateful to each of you, not just for joining us today, but for the work that you're doing. You are representative of us, to be able to showcase your involvement, your expertise has been incredible. And I am so grateful, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing to partner. Please visit our website for this recording, which will be made available. And thank you all very much. We hope to have more conversations with you all on these and other important subjects in the future. Bye-bye.